On Primetime Politics, refusing to give in.
Stand up and tell Canadians today the names of the MPs working against Canada.
Conservatives continue to push the government on the NSICOP report, demanding the names of MPs be released, those who allegedly helped a foreign government. A true security concern or political theater? We will speak to our journalist panel. Also,
when you leave the protection of Earth and go into deep space, you're committed to the entire journey. You just can't turn around and come home.
Going where no Canadian has gone before. Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen talks about his upcoming mission to the moon. And
on the margins, there's been exploitation, and I think that's something that has happened throughout the course of this program that has been going on for a couple decades.
Protecting foreign caregivers by giving them a quicker path to residency. We'll hear from the Immigration Minister Marc Miller about a new initiative introduced this week. This is Primetime Politics. Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. For days now, Conservative MPs have been calling on the government to release names, wanting to identify those members who allegedly helped foreign actors to interfere in Canadian affairs. The allegations are contained in a report tabled this week by the National Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliamentarians. But instead of naming names, this is what we've heard from the Trudeau Liberals.
Our government has put in place enhanced tools to fight foreign interference in Canada. That's important, and we've done that.
And I would simply point out the series of measures, beginning with the creation of NSICOP and the series of other measures that have been put in place by this government over the past years.
We have put in place measures like the NSICOP committee. We are currently debating C-70 in committee, which will bring forward more provisions to help strengthen our democratic institutions.
Well, to talk about this, we're now joined by Tonda MacCharles, the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star, Joël-Denis Bellavance, the Ottawa Bureau Chief for La Presse, and Kristy Kirkup, parliamentary reporter with the Globe and Mail. Hello to the three of you.
Hi there. Hello.
Hi there.
So, now, I haven't seen you in a while, Tonda, so I'm going to start with you on this one, because is this, as we've been hearing, just political theater on the part of Conservatives to get the government to name names here, or is there a larger security issue that the government needs to do a better job of addressing?
I think it can be both at the same time. There's for sure a lot of theater involved in this because it's a very explosive report. You know, up to now we've been talking about foreign interference in all the other inquiries in the context of was this or that last two elections affected. But this report came at us on Monday and just painted a much broader picture, you know, not just elections, but through and in between elections. More broadly, it's raised a big concern and shown or indicated that there is credible allegations around there being sitting MPs who are also former references, but sitting MPs working with foreign actors, foreign state actors. So that's big, that's new, that's a real security issue the government has to address. And absolutely, it falls smack at the end of a struggling parliament that's very polarized, and there are theatrics around absolutely everything. So nobody should have expected this was going to be different. And to me, to be honest, the whole question about naming, whether or not to name these people, when the head of the committee that released this report and referenced this said they didn't actually question the whole idea of where do we go from here, and, you know, does it cast a pall over everybody, that they didn't actually contemplate that question, how it should be answered, was astonishing as well. Yeah. So lots to explore.
Joël-Denis, what do you think?
Well, it shows one thing, that there was a lack of preparation on the part of the Liberal government and the Prime Minister's office on how to react to this. It is surprising because Mr. Trudeau received that report unredacted on March 22nd. So he had time to prepare for the release of that report and give us a more, I would say, convincing response. Now, as Tonda pointed out, it's the first time the spotlight is on parliamentarians in this whole affair of foreign affair interference. And we talk about parliamentarians because it involves MPs, but also senators. Don't forget that. And to me, the CSIS director, David Vigneault, testified last week, yesterday in front of the committee, and suggested a roadmap that should be of interest to party leaders. They should have access to the list of the MPs or senators who are actually suspected of being in cahoot with foreign countries, and ask them an explanations. And if they're not satisfied, make arrangements so that those MPs do not run again in the next elections. They owe it to Canadians, they owe it to Parliament, they owe it to Canada. So that's their responsibility. It's up to them now to act.
Kristy, what's your take on it? This debate is whether or not the names should be named.
You know, I think to Tonda and Joël-Denis' point about, it was quite surprising that the government seemed to be caught flat-footed on this, given the amount of runway that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had. And it is wild to think, again, that somehow this report would not become a bombshell moment that would cast aspersions, frankly, for MPs, for senators. And it was interesting, outside of the Liberal caucus, there were a lot of reporters. I was there, people kind of saying, well, what is it like inside the caucus? Are you looking over your shoulder and wondering about your colleagues? And some of the MPs were saying, well, no, we're not looking at it that way. And I also find that very surprising, because how could that not be the case? Ultimately, yes, this is going to come down to a question of law enforcement. The RCMP has confirmed, of course, that it is aware of the committee's report. I think that the chair of the committee did lay out about how members of the committee are bound to the Security of Information Act, which is incredibly serious. They could be prosecuted should they actually reveal the information that they knew in order to put together this report. He tried to say, they did a very careful job in terms of what, went as far as they possibly could in the text of the report. But I don't understand how this is snowballed into the moment that it is right now, left up to this ultimate question of, okay, well, now over to the RCMP, and we're just going to wait to see what law enforcement does. It is, consumes so much oxygen on Parliament Hill, as it should, because of the very serious nature of the contents of that report.
Yeah, well, you use the word aspersions, and I was wondering about how this affects each of the caucuses. How can you move forward knowing that there are credible allegations of members of Parliament, as you said, the Senate as well, who were wittingly working with foreign actors? So how do you think this is affecting the caucuses right now on the Hill?
Look, it's hard to get a read. Obviously, they're always cautious about revealing what's going on inside, but you talked to a lot of MPs this week. Many said to us that, it casts a pall over all of us because nobody has the ability to refute it right now. Everybody, the finger is being pointed at a lot of people. And I think that, it's very clear in the report that they say very specifically that Chinese Canadian politicians have been targeted. So if you're a Chinese Canadian sitting lawmaker, how can you not wonder if they're talking about you, and how can your colleagues not wonder? It says so right there. So look, it's now, I think, a live debate whether or not the party leaders should take the next step. The members of that committee are sworn to secrecy for life, but constitutional experts do say that the party leaders can benefit from parliamentary immunity and go into Parliament and deal with this, name people and deal with it within their caucuses. Will they do so? I don't see that happening soon. I think there are things that are going to play out still. The government constantly reminds us that there are caveats around this information we're not aware of, that there is context we're not aware of. Be that as it may, I think it is incumbent, the pressure will build on them to do something within their own caucuses.
Quickly, Joël-Denis.
On that front, the Bloc Québécois leader, Yves-François Blanchet, intends to get the security clearance necessary to have access to the documents. And so, because he told me today that he wants to make sure that nobody in his caucus is actually under the influence of foreign states. So, and so if a separatist leader can do that in a federal institution, how come the leader of the Conservative Party does not intend to do it? That will put pressure on Mr. Poilievre to act. I would like to point out that Mr. Singh, the NDP leader, has already asked the security and clearance necessary to have access to those documents, and he will do probably the same exercise. So the sort of a question in caucus in the Bloc Québécois and NDP will take place. It will remain the two other parties who actually can form government to decide whether they're going to follow the same steps.
Yeah, quickly running time. Did you want to add something quickly on this one?
Yeah, I think that there is that political dynamic. If you have the bloc leader coming out and saying, well, this is not going to stand, I have to get more information, the NDP leader taking the steps already to do so, it begs the question, again, what are the Conservatives going to do and what are the Liberals going to do? Yeah. And that necessary follow-up has to take place.
Okay, so we're going to watch that. But before we're done, I also want to talk about a new Léger poll. And this was conducted by Léger for Québecor Media. Take a look at the results right now, because when you look at the province of Quebec in particular, right now the Bloc Québécois still holds a 31% support. So they're in the lead, although Léger calls that a fragile lead. But look at the Tories and the Liberals, tied at 26% each. You know, Joël-Denis, Léger notes the fact that even Stephen Harper was not able to accomplish what we're seeing under Pierre Poilievre. How significant is this number?
It is, because if a party reaches over 25, it reaches a zone where it is very much contributing to the election of seats in Quebec. So 26% would probably get the Conservative around 20 to 22 seats in Quebec, which is major. It would be double what they have right now. So I think we're about, if the pieces fall as we think they will, about 14 months away from the next federal election. That can change again, and you never know. Once there is a movement, it can swing very far in one direction. We've seen it with the orange wave in 2011.
Okay, so that's true. You know it better than I, that Quebecers tend to vote, you know, and move fast.
When they swing, they swing.
Okay, when they swing, they swing. But I was interested, other data in that poll suggests that nevertheless there are at least half of Quebecers still very skeptical about Mr. Poilievre's leadership. And I also went back and reminded myself about the results in the last few campaigns for the last Conservative leader. And, you know, Stephen Harper, yeah, he's right. They didn't get 26%, but he got, guess what? He got like 24.6, so nearly 25% of the vote. In Quebec gave him 10 seats. That was his high point. Then he came down, got the same 10 seats with only 21.7% of the vote in the 08 campaign. In 2011, he got 5 seats with 16%. Okay, so his vote's going down. The next parliament, there's 343 ridings that are going to be tested, right? So I'm not sure we can put those numbers on seat counts yet. And to me, the drill down on how do Quebecers perceive the leader is really important. I think that's still an open question. I think that Canadians and Quebecers are still asking themselves what kind of government would Mr. Poilievre form. That's not to say, by the way, that they aren't completely fed up with Mr. Trudeau.
Yeah, well, and also the fact that Pierre Poilievre has had a very clear Quebec strategy, you know, ever since one being chosen as party leader, but the convention was in Quebec City. He begins every question period in French, not in English. Well, what do you make of the number, Kristy?
Yeah, I think this shows the effort that has really gone into trying to shore up support in Quebec. And frankly, if you look back at, you know, other, you know, more recent Conservative leaders, Andrew Scheer, Aaron O'Toole, they tried to make inroads in Quebec, and you can see that Pierre Poilievre and his team, they know what they're doing. They are masters at political strategy and essentially building the infrastructure of what they hope will be a majority government the next time that Canadians head to the polls. And they know that Quebec is central to that success. I think that ultimately, again, a lot remains to be seen what will happen with the vote, specifically in Quebec. But this is, if you're Pierre Poilievre and the team, I think you're looking at those numbers and thinking this is going according to plan. And, you know, they are in campaign mode. They are acting like they are in campaign mode pretty much every single day, looking at that next election. They're not waiting for the vote to be called. Yeah,
and of course, you know, here we have a Trudeau government essentially built in Atlantic Canada, Ontario, and Quebec, and now, you know, trailing in Ontario, trouble in Atlantic Canada, now trouble in Quebec. Watching it all, thank you very much for this. We're out of time. Tonda, Joël-Denis, Kristy, thank you for this.
Thank you, Michael.
Have a good weekend.
You too. 2025. If all goes to plan, that is the year when Colonel Jeremy Hansen will finally make his journey to space. The lone Canadian on the Artemis 2 mission, Jeremy Hansen will accomplish a few things that no Canadian has done before him. First, he will go into deep space, and then he will orbit the moon. It will ensure that his name will forever be in the history books. And for more on the mission, I did speak with Colonel Hansen recently. at the Canadian Aviation and Space Museum in Ottawa.
If you go really big picture, looking at the Artemis program, we're trying to get to Mars. We actually hold that lofty long-term goal up against everything we're doing to see how does it inform our decision-making, the infrastructure we create now. Are we buying down risk to eventually send humans to Mars? So we actually hold it against that litmus test. Of course, the next step for Artemis is the moon. And we know there are many objectives we can obtain and test out on the lunar surface and in the vicinity of the moon. We're going to build a gateway space station around the moon. We're trying to generate a lunar economy to support future exploration into deeper space. We have science objectives during the Artemis program. We want to go to the south pole of the moon, a place we've never been before, a place we believe has water in the form of ice trapped in some of the permanently shadowed craters.
Which would make a permanent base easier to achieve, correct?
So if you find water on the moon, it could, if you could figure out how to use that water, you could obviously drink it, you can split it into its elements, you have oxygen to breathe, hydrogen for fuel, and so it would be a resource in space that would further enable us to explore into deeper space, maybe turning the moon into a jumping off point where you refuel on your way to Mars. These are some of the things that we will explore. If they're true and we can find the technology to leverage these resources, it could change how we solve some of the bigger challenges of going to Mars.
Can you compare and contrast that, though? Because, you know, I think there are people out there that might be scratching their heads because, as you say, Artemis is going to learn more about the moon. But the Apollo program got humanity to the moon. Neil Armstrong walked on the moon more than 50 years ago. What do we still not know that initial mission to the moon did not accomplish?
We still have the Apollo samples that we brought back during the Apollo missions. They're still studied today. And, you know, when you speak to geologists right now, they're super fired up about going back to the moon because they have more questions and answers from the samples we have. There are still mysteries to uncover from the moon, things to prove out. I've often heard these geologists refer to the moon as the Rosetta Stone of our solar system. It just has different information on it. On Earth, it's been eroded by the rain and the weather and all of those, the volcanoes and the lava. The Earth has been recycled time over time, but the moon is a time capsule. And we've only visited really small area of the moon. It's a huge place. So there's lots more that we'll learn. Things we probably don't know yet, which is kind of always fun to imagine. One of the benefits of exploration is just to go and figure out what is it that we're missing.
As I said, though, Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, and yet Artemis has taken a choice to one, make it to the moon with Artemis 1, orbit the moon, as you will do with Artemis 2, and then finally land in Artemis 3. Why do it in 3 phases rather than just picking up where Neil Armstrong left and actually landing on the moon?
You really have to understand how you work through a testing and development program to realize why we have the architecture we have. It's actually a pretty aggressive architecture. So we're creating new vehicles, new infrastructure to go back to the moon. They're not just replicas of Apollo. They're nothing like Apollo. The capsule, for example, is much larger. We can hold a crew of 4 for just one example, which means it got larger, which means the heat shield technology had to change, which brings along new challenges for us. We need more energy. Apollo reached its absolute maximum just getting to the equatorial regions of the moon. It had nothing else left to give. But we want to go into other orbits. We want to go into these orbits that will support our Gateway space station. We want to go to the south pole of the moon. But these things take more energy, so we needed to build a new architecture to do that. Anytime you change the architecture, you have to start from scratch. We certainly bring all the lessons of Apollo into the discussion today. We learn from Apollo, and we go back and we revisit Apollo all the time to make sure we're picking up where they left off. But we're trying to do more than they were capable of doing, which means we have to test. And so Artemis 1 is sort of like the first missions of Apollo where they were testing rockets on crewed. Apollo 7 was a flight just around Earth, in Earth orbit, which we're not doing. We're sort of doing Apollo 7 and Apollo 8 in Artemis 2, where we'll spend 1 day in Earth orbit, but then we will fly around the moon on Artemis 2 to test out that capsule. And that's the first time we put humans on that vehicle. When you leave the protection of Earth and go into deep space, you're committed to the entire journey. You just can't turn around and come home. And so you actually want to have that experience operating the capsule in Earth orbit before you leave for the moon, which we will do on day 1 of our mission, for example.
Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen. Now, you can see my full interview with Colonel Hansen this weekend on CPAC. He's featured on the next edition of Profile. You can watch it here on our channel or whenever you'd like once it has premiered online and on the CPAC website. While caregivers from other countries may get residency sooner than expected, this week the immigration minister introduced a program that will give caregivers from abroad permanent Canadian residency status upon arrival. Now, the program is expected to help address the demand for caregivers in this country, but also protect new arrivals from abuses once they arrive. It's a matter I talked about with the immigration minister earlier this week. Well, joining us right now is the Minister for Immigration, Marc Miller. Minister, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
Listen, let's begin here with the caregivers, because what you're proposing is an immediate path to permanent residency. This is instead of 12 months of Canadian work experience. What's driving the change? Why are you prioritizing this?
Well, first, I think it fundamentally makes sense. These are people that come to Canada to take care of the people we prize the most, our older generations and the very young. And often they've been in very precarious positions for 12, 24 months, often beholden to one employer. And on the margins, there's been exploitation. And I think that's something that has happened throughout the course of this program that has been going on for a couple decades. And Canada expects us to take care of the people that take care of our most important generations. And so that I think it made sense as a matter of fairness. Also in that same vein, making sure that the language requirements of those people do not present an additional barrier to permanent residency, where comparable programs in other jurisdictions in Canada require sort of a level 4 language knowledge. This is something that was just smart to do, and I think it was high time. I talked to a number of caregivers and their advocacy groups, and they say they've been fighting for this for 20 years, so it's a good thing to do. And given the current numbers and requirements of people to provide care with an aging population, this is something I think we needed to act on.
Okay, so a need in terms of the population base here in Canada, but you used the word exploitation, Minister. What kind of stories were you hearing about that was concerning to you?
Well, I'd say first and foremost, work conditions, abusive behavior, clearly people and the impact that this has had on folks' mental health. We're often, let's not hide the fact that we're often talking about people from the Philippines, often women separated from their families. So that longer period where they're separated from their families, taking that difficult decision to go into a country like Canada where they're expected to be treated fairly, that sort of all added up to something that needed to be done as a matter of principle, but also as a matter of practice for a group of people that are vulnerable in their employment situation.
And to be clear, by giving them permanent status right away, it gives them the freedom to pursue another employer if one is being abusive, also gives them more ability to travel in and out of the country?
Sure, yeah. Although let's be clear also, there are a number of caregivers that are permanent residents and they choose to do so. It just was one of the factors that contributed to people not being treated as fairly as they should be.
Okay, now will there be a cap on this? Will there be a ceiling for a number that you're willing to distribute every year?
Yeah, so there's always within these pilot projects, and we do intend to make this permanent over time, there are caps, so it is not an unlimited number of people.
Okay. Now, how will you know that the caregivers who do come will meet professional requirements? Because, you know, in the current setup, and I hear what you're saying about trying to prevent abuse, but, you know, in the current setup with 12 months, that does give an employer or some type of Canadian entity to assess whether or not the caregiver meets the requirements that are needed in this country.
Yeah, I mean, they still have to, when coming here, fulfill the criteria, and that's clear from the get-go. You know, these 12 or 24-month periods of temporary residency were not necessarily intended to be a dry run of people. People had to have the qualifications by coming here, and people do still have the luxury of dismissing people. That isn't being questioned here. This is about people's permanent residency, the option that they've been fighting for, that advocacy groups have been fighting for so long, to make this program more permanent as a matter of equity and fairness to caregivers.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's only a few weeks left in Parliament before the summer break. When do you expect this to actually be enacted and being able to start?
So the program does launch any time at the latest early 2025 to late 2024. We do have the unique situation of having a backlog of caregivers under the current programs that are expiring, so there'll be some transitional measures that we'll need to address, but that's sort of the timeline that we're looking at.
Okay. Now, before we're done here, I also want to talk to you about the situation in Gaza, because you did last week increase the number of Gaza reunification eligibility in terms of a program. You raised that cap to 5,000 applicants. Has anyone actually made it to Canada via that program yet?
We have had a number of landings. We certainly, in Canada, it's something we're monitoring quite closely, Michael. As an indicative measure, we have, I would say, and I'd have to check the latest numbers, but under this program, or just more humanitarian envelopes, about 500 visas that have been issued to folks in Cairo that are then moving on to their families that are sponsoring them in Canada. That number of people in Canada is less than 500, to the best of my knowledge. But we are constantly monitoring the people coming to Canada and their process of reunification.
Monitoring, but are you helping to get them out of Gaza, given, of course, the situation on the ground? I'm wondering just what Canadian Global Affairs is doing to help people get out.
We continue, Michael, our diplomatic efforts, whether it's Global Affairs or Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada, through diplomatic means to advocate first and foremost for a ceasefire and release of hostages. That is the best way to open up the borders, which have been currently closed since May 7th. Up to now, people have had to take matters into their own hands and often have to pay bribes to get through Rafah border, which is unacceptable. Again, we're doing all we can in circumstances where we do not control everything going on, indeed very little going on at Rafah gates, and we don't have the direct influence to be able to extract people. So we have to use our diplomatic equity and continue to advocate for people to be treated safely and for people under this program to be eligible for transition into Canada through Cairo. We had, just before operations began most recently in Rafah by the Israeli Minister of Defense, had a breakthrough in the program, in particular where they were going to assist in that departure, but obviously events superseded that.
Quickly running in time, but I do want to ask you one question, and I appreciate it's not your portfolio, but of course NSICOP did issue a report earlier this week. We heard Michael Chong in the House of Commons today pushing your government to release the names of MPs who may have helped foreign entities. I'm wondering what your position is on that, because it seems to be that your government does not want to release the names at this point.
I don't think it's a question of want, Michael, and let's recall that this is a body who produced this report that exists because our government put it into place. It's very important, and they are sworn to secrecy. It may surprise some, but I'm not privy to that information, so very hard to speculate without having myself being privy to that information.
Okay. Well, Minister Miller, I always appreciate the time, and thank you for this evening.
Thank you.
And that is Primetime Politics. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back next week. Until then, have a great weekend.